So today on Ancient DOS Games, I felt it'd be a good idea to take a look back at one of the games which helped to define the fighting game genre as it is today. That game being the original Street Fighter. Now, the funny thing about the original Street Fighter is that its sequel, Street Fighter 2, completely eclipsed it on every level and was a phenomena in and of itself, rising to a level of popularity few games ever achieve. But was the sequel really that much better than the original? Well, short answer, yes. The original Street Fighter wasn't a brilliant game by any means. In fact, it wasn't even meant to be anything special. It was just a neat idea Capcom had in terms of making a fighting game where players could feel the force of their aggression transfer through to the characters on screen. This was done by having two very large rubber-padded buttons on the machine to use for punching and kicking, whereby how hard you hit the button would translate to how powerful of an attack you'd get in response. However, either due to complaints of these padded buttons wearing out very quickly, or because they didn't work in the cocktail form factor, I couldn't figure out which, a revision was made which instead had 3 standard buttons for punches and 3 standard buttons for kicks, each of which represented light, medium, and heavy strength, which is the control format Street Fighter games have continued to use up to this day. Because the game was designed to be more gimmicky than well-balanced, playing it nowadays really feels kinda awkward, especially given the pioneering notion of having special moves, done by inputting certain combinations of controls, and the methodology for achieving this wasn't exactly done very well. In fact, the precision required to execute special moves is so tight that it's very hard to get them to trigger consistently. But that's something we'll get into in a bit. Basically, what I'm trying to say is the reason Street Fighter 2 got so much more attention over the original is because the original really wasn't all that groundbreaking by comparison, and isn't even remotely well balanced. Street Fighter was originally created by Capcom in 1987 for arcades, though the DOS port came about in 1988, being developed by a small team simply known as Micro Talent. And while Capcom originally published this themselves, High-Tech Expressions would take over publishing before too long. Now, supposedly this is a 1 to 2 player fighting game, but I couldn't figure out how to get the 2-player mode working. Now, on the original arcade machine, player 1 was always Ryu, and player 2 was always Ken, both with an identical moveset. But here in the DOS version, there doesn't seem to be any way to play as Ken, despite the box for the game advertising 2-player simultaneous gameplay. The instructions don't help either, making no mentions whatsoever towards a 2-player mode even existing. So, as far as I can tell, the DOS version's 1-player only, despite evidence to the contrary. In terms of video, it was originally released with support for CGA 4 color and EGA 16 color graphics running at 320 by 200 resolution, and in terms of audio, it only supported PC speaker sound. Yes, I know, what you're seeing right now is absolutely not running in EGA or using PC speaker sound. We'll get into that a bit later. In terms of its current release date though, it's still commercial, and finding a copy of the original release is virtually impossible. Now, thankfully, it showed up in at least a couple compilations that I'm aware of. The one I have coming from a 1994 CD, including Street Fighter, Street Fighter 2, Mega Man, and Mega Man 3, all for DOS. Because there's so few of any releases of this game out there, though, I wasn't able to gauge any reliable prices. However, I will say, the DOS version is definitely inferior to the arcade original, so if you're not trying to build a collection of some sort and just want to play the game, go for an arcade compilation instead, as they're easier to find and fairly inexpensive. There's technically a story to Street Fighter, but it's really not much of one. Basically, some organization is holding a worldwide tournament where registered fighters must find each other out on the streets and do battle, and whoever successfully wins combat against all the registered fighters goes to Thailand to face off against the quote-unquote champions of the tournament, the final opponent being Sagat, who would return in subsequent Street Fighter games with a scar across his face as a result of Ryu and Ken's Dragon Punch during this tournament. When you start a new game, you're able to choose which country you want to tackle first, with choices of Japan, USA, England, and China. Though in the arcade version, this may be restricted to just Japan and USA off the bat, if the game's set up that way. Combat itself is, well, clunky at best. The irony is that the controls work exactly as you'd expect them to, moving around, jumping, even blocking by holding back. The trick is dealing with the AI and, well, actually attacking in the first place. So one of the things you need to get used to right off the bat with Street Fighter is that the moment you press an attack button is not the moment the attack occurs. It occurs when you release the attack button. Now, this takes a lot of getting used to and changes the timing of special moves dramatically, since there's actually a delay after you first release the attack button before it will trigger. Now, with special moves, I found the best way to get them to work the most consistently is to press the attack button first, perform the special move motion very quickly, and then release the attack button. Again, this has to be done very quick and without making any mistakes, because the game is very intolerant of minor deviations to the special move inputs, unlike almost every other fighting game since, which allows for single input deviations and more than just a single frame of time delay between expected inputs. The special moves are actually the same here as they are for Ryu and Ken in later games, doing a quarter circle back plus kick for the Hurricane Kick, a quarter circle forward plus punch for the Hadoken Fireball, and a down forward Z motion for the Dragon Punch. These special moves do an incredible amount of damage, so learning to perform them is essential for getting anywhere in this game, especially given how brutal the AI can be. Now, the AI opponents are no joke. They will spam their special moves given half the chance, and they can hit with their regular moves much faster than the player can. However, I have noted that every opponent does behave differently to some degree, and each of them generally has at least one special move from Ryu and Ken that they're not well suited to dealing with because of how they move or attack. And when you do finally get your first victory, you're also treated to the game's abysmally bit-crushed voice audio.
Don't forget all over the world.
And curiously, every fighter in the game has their own victory comment when they win a round, but they're all voiced by the same person. And if you lose a battle outright, the ending dialogue is the same for all of them, again with the same voice actor. Now thankfully, if you do lose a round, you can continue. At least you can in the arcade version. So yeah, this might have been a little bit obvious, but I've kind of been trolling all of you for the entire video so far. What you've been watching is not the DOS version of Street Fighter. It's the arcade original. Now, given how relatively unknown the original Street Fighter is, I felt it was important to establish how the original game plays and what the expectations were for a home computer or home console port. Furthermore, I should emphasize that most ports of Street Fighter are not all that bad, with the TurboGrafx CD port probably being the most arcade accurate, despite being renamed to Fighting Street for whatever reason. Although none of them are up to arcade standards, which is not surprising. But the DOS port is probably the worst of the bunch. So without further ado, here's the DOS version of Street Fighter. Yeah, this is just bad. The screens don't scroll, the characters are tiny, we've got standard fonts in place for the text, no stylizing to the status indicators whatsoever, barely any sound effects. Did they even bother to digitize the voices at all?
What strength, but don't forget there are many guys like you all over the world.
Nah, just kidding. This is what it actually sounds like. Yeah, it sounds like nothing. They didn't even try to digitize the voice samples. In fact, another thing missing are the bonus stages. In the original arcade version, after every 2 fights, you'd get a bonus stage for some extra points for the high score table. Well, the DOS version doesn't even have the high score table, and thus doesn't include the bonus stages whatsoever. Even the bit which shows a plane flying between different countries has been cut. What we do get for the DOS version is a severe lack of animation, probably an attempt to get everything to fit onto a single floppy disk, except the game references there being a second floppy disk and actually takes up about 80 more K than a 720 kilobyte 3.5-inch disk, so even that goal wasn't met. In fact, the lack of attention to detail is kind of impressive. And to give an example of what I mean, you'll note that a lot of background graphics don't actually look all that bad. But take a look at this one, which is supposed to take place in China. If you're looking at this and getting the impression that it feels a bit off, just take a look at the same scene from the arcade original side by side. Yeah, for some inexplicable reason, all of the Chinese writing has been redone as Japanese writing for a location in China. I'm really not sure how you even make a mistake like that, as any excuse I can think of doesn't cut it. In any case, as you've probably noticed by now, the DOS version is definitely a downgrade from the arcade version. And yes, it plays worse too. Instead of there being 6 buttons for punches and kicks, you only have 2. And if you're playing with a joystick, you only get 1, with punches and kicks alternating. The way it determines light, medium, and heavy attacks is by how long you hold the button down for. So it's kind of a weird way of doing it, but at least I understand what they were going for, and given how the controls worked in the arcade, I'm not surprised by this methodology. In terms of performing the special moves, it's, bad. Basically, the same sort of problems exist here as in the arcade original, except now, instead of the frame rate being the deciding factor, it's the input buffer, which runs faster than the frame rate. Thus, to perform a special move, you have to input the precise sequence of buttons lightning fast, all while taking into account the delay of punches and kicks not being performed immediately. Now, I found the best timing for this was to press and release the punch and kick button, and then instantly follow it up with every directional button in sequence and try to get it all done in less than a single frame. Although, before I figured that out, I noticed that if you just rapidly mash all the directions and buttons necessary for a special move, you'll still get it to trigger. So yes, this is probably one of the only fighting games out there with special moves where button mashing can actually bring you to victory. The crazy thing too is the instructions don't say anything about how to perform these moves. In fact, the instruction cards for the arcade original never did either. The thinking was that players should have to discover the moves on their own, but given the fact that it's virtually impossible to beat the game without the special moves, that's kind of saying something. Although ironically, unlike in the arcade original, where knowing the special moves makes things better, but you still have a hard game, knowing the special moves here in the DOS version makes the game incredibly easy, as the AI won't perform any attacks whatsoever until it's within a particular range of the player. The AI also has no idea how to block fireballs, and each one drains the enemy's health by a quarter. So yeah, spamming Hadokens will get you through almost the entire game. Until you get to Sagat, who is the only character in the DOS port with a projectile attack, and will murder you fairly easily unless you get super lucky with your fireballs. And when you beat Sagat, yeah, just a bit of text, nothing more. The last thing I want to mention too is that this DOS port has some buggy timing routines. Now, maybe it's emulation related, but what was happening is that every once in a while, the game would suddenly skip ahead by several hundred frames. I swear, what you're about to see has not been altered or edited in any way. Yeah, well, I was doing a hurricane kick, doing damage, and then suddenly I was dead and on a different screen from the fight. I recorded another instance of this skip ahead happening too, and you're gonna see that now. Again, no idea if it's the emulation of the game itself, but given some of the instances of graphical clipping, damage being taken out of thin air, fireballs instantly reaching targets at random or not traveling their whole distance, being locked in place when you use a fireball and miss, the lack of high scores, bonus stages, or even freaking continues. Just, wow. Overall, this DOS port of Street Fighter is kind of a joke. In fact, one of my Patreon supporters, Matthew Belshon, the same person who sent me this game in the first place, asks, why was Street Fighter ported to DOS? With 4 question marks. Really, it was just Capcom not being too careful about how their stuff was getting ported in their attempts to market and cross-promote everything. Granted, most of the other ports suffer from the tech that was available at the time, but the DOS port definitely got the short end of the stick. If you want to experience this game nowadays, go for the arcade original, as it can be found in various Capcom arcade game collections, which is how I even have a legal copy of it. But this DOS version, nope, don't even bother. It's an interesting little piece of Street Fighter lore, but absolutely not worth playing anymore. Hey, that rhymed. If you must play this version of the game, then all you have to do to get it working in DOSBox is leave cycle set to auto, and you should be good to go. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next Saturday for ADG Pro, we're going to be investigating the stats presented in an FMV game to see if they actually mean anything or not, and if so, how they actually compare to each other. So make sure to stay tuned to see if said FMV game has more depth to it than it seems. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys.